Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
Again, at the beginning of the show, we like to thank our patrons who help sponsor the show and who have become friends of ours. Thank you to our patrons over and over again.
We sure do. Thank you. We appreciate you. We appreciate not only the monetary support, but also the emotional support that you give us. You keep cheering us on and saying good things, and we appreciate that so much.
That is very true. So this week's episode, this is episode 127.
Can you believe that, Jimmy?
I know. It's wild.
Yeah, it is.
But we wanted to talk about the most asked questions that we receive. And not just talk about it, but I'm really excited about this. Mom and I were just talking about this before we started recording. We are going to be making a series of short videos. By short, I mean probably 30 minutes to an hour max. And we're going to be using a platform called Ribbon. And I've spoken to one of the co-founders, Mateo. So I'm going to put a plug in for Ribbon. And it is an excellent company. It's a new startup company. It's an incredible platform, and they do kind of like Netflix, on-demand rentals for videos. So we're going to be producing content and putting that up to my website, and the content is going to be driven by you guys, the listeners. Over the last 9 years, we've gotten a plethora of questions, and a lot of these questions we get asked over and over and over again. So we just kind of organized this and structured this with the most asked questions, and with the understanding that these are going to be put into, or actually being put into resources right now. So it becomes really difficult when people ask questions and they're like, "Hey, have you ever had a podcast, or have you ever written a blog about this question?" And I have to go back and I have to search and search and search, and sometimes I can find them, and sometimes we've talked about most of the stuff in the context of particular episodes, but it wasn't necessarily an episode pertaining to that particular question. So it just becomes, this issue of trying to find a needle in a haystack. And we don't want you guys to have to do that. We want to streamline all of this, take all of the most asked questions, bundle that up into a group of videos, and make that as a resource and make that readily available. So we are working on that.
When Jimmy presented this idea to me, which was just recently, I got so excited I found it difficult to sleep. I honestly did. I think this is such an incredible idea for a resource to share among everyone. These questions are hard questions, most of them. They're questions that are asked repeatedly, and they are questions that need answered. And like Jimmy said, often we've touched on these, but not necessarily devoted an entire podcast to these, and certainly not in the format that these short videos will be. So we are doubly excited. We truly are about this.
Yes. And the cool thing about on demand is if you don't want to do like a monthly subscription where you keep getting additional videos that we add each month, you can just rent one particular video, and then, we can set how long that unlocks it for. Typically it's like 30 days. So for a whole month, you have access to that particular video. And, if you don't want to listen to all the other questions that don't pertain to you, great. Just find the video that does pertain to you, that is your question.
Right.
And you just rent that that
I just love
particular
that.
video.
Love that idea.
So it's very affordable, very accessible, and we love the platform. So the website, if any of you are interested in doing this, and in the face of a pandemic, a lot of businesses are having to get really creative with how they reach their customers because they can't reach them in person anymore. So a lot of yoga people are going this route, and just the sky's the limit with who can do it. But the website is Ribbon, with Ribbon, WITHRIBBON, withribbon.com. Again, we are not, full disclaimer, I am not receiving any money from them. They are not sponsoring this podcast. I believe in Ribbon and their website and what they do, what they stand for. So this is my own personal plug for Ribbon, withribbon.com. Okay, most asked questions. We are not answering these questions. We are simply just laying them out there so that you guys are aware of what's on the radar of our listeners.
Jimmy, when you said the most asked questions over the past 9 years, it kind of floors me that this has been ongoing with us for 9 years now. It's a long time.
Yeah, it is.
And a lot of these questions are still burning within our hearts yet. That's how this is difficult. It's painful.
Yep.
It's ongoing. We've learned a lot since we first began on this journey together.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, our initial podcast, the information we have now is going to be somewhat different in that we've learned so much more through experience. So, thank you for, this idea, which came from Jimmy, obviously, because he gets the bulk of the questions asked to him repeatedly. I get mostly ones that pertain to marriages and abuse within families and whatnot, but Jimmy gets the overall questions. So
and I do keep track of them.
Yes,
so
you
even
do.
if even if I don't have time, because I just can't respond
Right.
to every email. It's impossible. There's not enough time in the world. So I do save them. I keep them. I tuck them away. And then I just kind of group them together. They're not real strongly organized yet, but that'll happen more as we develop the videos and come up with a pretty intense outline. But anyway, we do keep track of the questions. So even if we don't answer, we are making note of your questions. Okay, number 1, most asked questions. How do I cope when my friends and church have abandoned me? That's one that I get asked almost every day. Probably hundreds of times I've been asked that question. How do I cope when my friends and my church have abandoned me? The alienation, the loneliness, people who scatter and go the opposite direction when you're in trouble. That is a common theme. So, Mom?
Okay, the next one, how do I find support as the spouse of an abuse victim? And that's a question that I get asked a lot. And when Jimmy gets asked that, he usually turns that over to me. And that's a critical one because, as we know, as spouses of the abuse victim, we need support. We need additional support. So that's a critical one that we'll be talking about. And also, when our church is going to address domestic violence. This is a big one. This isn't what our platform is about solely, but we do intertwine this domestic violence in with sexual abuse because domestic violence is certainly abuse, and it is heightened right now due to COVID, especially. The numbers have climbed increasingly, so we will be touching on domestic violence also.
And I'll say too, that I mean, as soon as we started podcasting, listeners were reaching out to us and saying, well, that's great that you talk about sexual abuse, but what about domestic violence?
Right.
Because there's so much overlap in how abusers operate. And you guys aren't talking about domestic violence. And the reason we weren't, and, we do now, but we haven't delved real deeply into it, The reason is not because we're ignoring domestic violence, but our personal experience involved sexual abuse of minors.
Right.
And so we really specialize in sexual abuse and not domestic violence. But that's not to say that, we can't develop resources, because it is a rampant, huge problem. And we get asked questions about domestic violence constantly. In fact, a lot of our listeners to this podcast are not sexual abuse survivors. They're domestic violence survivors.
Also, in talking with people, just briefly, I've found that domestic violence is often coupled in some way with sexual abuse. So,
marital rape,
yes.
Abuse, sexual abuse as minors.
Right.
Yeah, it is oftentimes.
Yes.
Here's another question. I struggle with what to do about my experience with domestic violence. I'm out of the home, but our children are forced to be into unsupervised contact with a man my psychologist and pastor say is a narcissist and sociopath. I want to tell my side of the story, but people fear for my safety and our children's safety. So much of the last decade has been blind to a very devious smear campaign and psychological abuse that nearly cost me my life. He destroyed our home, my possessions, my health, my financials, and he's gotten away with it for now. He's allowed to spread lies about me and my family, but if I respond, then I'm bitter and vindictive. Man, that theme, this could be replicated thousands of times.
Mm-hmm.
And some of you listeners probably have chills just listening to that, because you're like, holy cow, did they just read my story?
Right.
This is incredibly common. And in the church, domestic violence has been handled very poorly, generally speaking. The next question: how do you respond when churches offer cheap grace and instant forgiveness to an abuser? That is probably the number one most asked question that I get. On my, I know it's on my YouTube channel. I think I have this on my website as well, and on the podcast. I turned it into a podcast. I did a 5-sermon series on forgiveness. And I think it surprised a lot of people. I don't take a position, because I don't think the Bible takes a position that you forgive people unless or until they repent. You owe them nothing. If somebody is a wolf, if somebody has destroyed your life, if somebody has turned your life inside out, you owe them nothing. And that is a biblical concept. So anyway, I think this is just a really important question, because victims are forced to forgive their abuser often, which spills into the next question. So, Mom, why don't you ask that one?
Okay. Why are victims forced to forgive their abuser instead of the abuser being forced to repent? Tough stuff. Jimmy and I have done several podcasts on this particular topic. And Jimmy, that series that you did on forgiveness was incredible. I would ask people to go back if you didn't hear it, or even if you did, re-listen to that. That was an incredible series that you gave. But this is hard stuff, because churches overall they go to the abused person and say, you'll never have peace, it'll never be okay unless you, the abused person, forgive the abuser. And it lays such a heavy weight upon the heart, and it's wrong, as you said. The next one: can you address churches that admonish women to stay in abusive marriages because marriages are permanent? Why are women told that they are to blame for their abusive husband's behavior, and that they, the wife, has to repent? Hard stuff. Once again, I have gotten multiple people email me and ask me this question, and it's always with such brokenness that I have women coming to me and saying, does the church not understand? Is this what Jesus would want? Is this what God wants a marriage to be like? is this, God would want me to stay in a marriage like this? And there is such guilt placed upon women if they do leave that it's, lots of times they're just ruined for life.
They're kicked out of the church.
They're kicked
if
out
they
of the
leave their
faith.
husband who is threatening their life, and that's not just a threat. I mean, domestic
No.
violence it's just that, it's violent. And I know we're preaching to the choir here on this podcast, but that always just leaves me dumbfounded, because why is the victim forced to stay in an abusive marriage where her life very well could end? I mean, there's physical violence, there's verbal, emotional abuse, financial abuse, on and on and on and on. And she's told, if you leave, you're not being a godly woman. Well, what about the deadbeat who's knocking her around the house?
Right.
Right. Why don't they address the abuser instead of the victim?
On the day of your dad's sentencing, I had a woman come up to me and get right in my face. And she said, if you had been a better wife, none of this would have happened. And I tell you, it cut through me like nothing else that has ever been said to me cut through me. And I still carry that pain. It hasn't healed yet this many years later. There was nothing I could have done better to prevent him from abusing children. Yet that was the concept. That was what I was told. If you had been a better wife. And so I certainly can understand this question, and it needs a lot of attention.
Yes, it does. And churches need to know how to respond
Yes.
and stop responding in this way that's, quite frankly, abusive.
Right.
Okay, next question. How can churches educate their congregation about signs of abuse and how to respond? That's my forte. How do you recognize when you have a predator, when predators are so immersed in deception? Because it is not as simple as listing a handful of this little checklist of red flag behaviors, and all of a sudden, we went to a 2-hour training, and now we know what to look for. The guy handing out bags of candy in the back, and it doesn't work that way. And I've gotten heat for saying that. I've been told that I'm going against all the best research that's out there. I'm okay with that because it doesn't work. I'm okay with bucking the system. I'm okay with not going along with the status quo because at the end of the day, I don't care about my reputation and what people think of me. I care about what actually works to protect children from abusers. And if we don't know how to spot them, we're not going to be able to stop them, prevent them from abusing kids.
Jimmy, I dare say that in all of the work that you have done over these past 9 years, I don't know of one time when you were in error, when someone has asked you to consult and help, where you weren't able to spot the abuser among the people. And
yeah, I'll
honestly,
root them out. I mean, that's what I do.
That God has given you a special intuitive mind for that, and it takes something special. And I think you've done that. So,
it's not fail proof. So I'm not.
But
I'm not certainly not 100% by any stretch of the imagination. But my point is we can do a whole lot better than what we're doing. Putting somebody through a 1-hour training or a 2-hour training where we're regurgitating the same research that's been out there since the 60s and 70s and saying, well, look for the guys who are handing out candy, who they just are attracted to kids and they don't have any adult friends.
They're the
and
scary man hiding behind the bushes staring at children.
It's all this kind of conventional wisdom based on a lot of incomplete research. And, I think we can and should take this a whole lot further and build on the research that's already out there.
Absolutely.
So that's my little soapbox. The next question, why are there different generational cohort differences in the way abuse is viewed? Many young people are appalled at the way older people excuse away abuse and are leaving the church because of it. There is a major struggle that I have when trying to convince older people that abuse is abuse. Generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, people who are the generation older than myself are kind of that old school mentality where, well, this happened 20 years ago, and what was she wearing, and what did she do to bring it on, and that kind of mentality does not compute with young people. Young people really get it, and that's an encouraging thing, by the way, because I think it's incredible that our younger people have this tremendous amount of wisdom and common sense, and they're like, hold up a second. This isn't okay. This kind of behavior where people are groping and grabbing and, having crude, saying crude jokes in front of their congregations. And, this kind of behavior is abuse. It's not okay. The younger generation really gets that. And I'm super encouraged by that. But there is this disconnect because most of the leadership, unfortunately, in our churches are comprised of these older people who just don't see it as abuse. It's just, it was a 15-year-old girl, and what 25-year-old man wouldn't want to, get with a 25 or a 15-year-old girl? That's their mentality. And they don't see it as abuse, and it is abuse. You cannot consent when you're a child, and it's not a relationship. It's not all the smoothing over and sanitized language that they want to use. It's not that. So, that's a very powerful, powerful question. Next up.
Okay. How do we respond when sex abuse doesn't fit the standard understanding of dangerous or abusive? And I think that's linked in with what Jimmy has said, linked very closely to that. Often people see abuse as not being dangerous or not being abusive. And a lot of that has to do with historically when we grew up. Let's put it that way. Back in my time, kids were, slapped across the face and told to sit back, keep quiet, and do not speak unless spoken to. Today, we're telling our children, speak up, tell us when something happens. Children were to be seen and not heard, and wives were to stay in the home strictly and to be servants, actually, to their husbands. I mean, that was an accepted, I hate to say it, but form of abuse. Biblically speaking, the Bible says, we are to uphold women and treat them in a special way. But historically, women were second-class citizens. So there's a lot of teaching and unteaching that needs to go on in order to correctly be able to understand dangerous or abusive behavior.
Absolutely. The next one, how do you instruct friends and church leaders who say that they take a strong stance against abuse, but when a real life example is sitting across the table from them, they fail to recognize it? Abuse gets called something else. Well, it was just marriage problems. Well, it was, our preacher was having a relationship with a 12-year-old. The language gets sanitized when there's a living, breathing person in front of them from the pulpit, or just in day-to-day conversation. If anybody ever abused somebody here, I'd be the first to step up and take care of it. I'd nip it in the bud and I'd take care of that person. But the question is, and it came from a friend of mine. She said, I've personally witnessed this time and time again, where when somebody's face to face with somebody, all of a sudden the person who was going to take this strong stance against abuse and stand up to the abuser, all of a sudden, well, it was just a misunderstanding.
Total glossing over.
He made a mistake. He fell into sin. We're all sinners after all, and on and on and on it goes. So the question is, how do we mesh the two of those, and what do we do with people who are in that category? And I think there's a lot of people who are that way. They say that they would stand up to an abuser, but in practice, and survivors of abuse know this, very few people stand up to an abuser.
I am actually involved with a family right now who is dealing with a situation that's horrendous, and they are glossing over everything, saying, well, the man only did this, and it was horrible what he did. He had too much to drink. And
I've heard that hundreds of times.
Excuse it. When push came to shove, when they were supposed to file charges, didn't happen because he just, it was just a rough night. He was upset.
Yeah, the alcohol made him become a pedophile.
The alcohol made him. Yeah, so that's another thing that we deal with commonly. Okay, let's see. What is the long-term effect of sexual abuse on a teen who thinks they were in a friendship, love relationship with the abuser? This happens so much also, where you get an older person, and it happens with preachers a lot. Somebody gets infatuated with a preacher, a doctor, a teacher, anybody in a position of authority and, a position of leadership, pays a little attention to someone who's a teenager perhaps, and the teenager falls in love. Or
so they think.
And the adult abuses horribly. The long-term effects are critically important to understand. This wasn't just a little infatuation. It wasn't just a little something that happened. It's abuse, out and out abuse by the adult. And we will address that one. And next, how do I overcome abuse as an adult? We have so many adults who are struggling right now, who were abused and are dealing with all kinds of repercussions of the abuse. And they want to know, how do I overcome this? How do I let go? Or is it even possible to let go?
And by the way, a lot of these people are being told, unless you forgive, you have all this bitterness stored up in your heart, and you're a bad little Christian or a bad little person, and you've not really healed, and you'll never heal. And that's just those are lies. It's just not true.
The guilt that is laid on people is unbelievable. So this will be a definite one that we want to address.
Another question, I want to go talk to the current preacher about abuse that happened at his church 50 years ago. How do I go about doing that? To me, this is about as indicative as you can get of how long these burdens linger in the lives of survivors. They want to talk freely about this. They want to tell people, they want to warn people, they want to validate that what happened to them in that space was wrong, that it was bad, and that the current leadership is going to do something so that that'll never happen again in that place, so far as they can help it, will never happen in that space again. This question is really powerful to me, because this is, again, incredibly common that people want to go back. In fact, Sandy, one of our patrons, who we did a fantastic interview with her and about her book. Sandy talked about how that was like this climactic event where she drove to the church where the abuse happened and confronted the leadership there. and, what that took and how exhausting that was and how much support it took from her husband. And, this is on the radar of virtually every survivor of abuse. Next question, what is the difference between justice and revenge? What a great question. Because often survivors are told that by bringing up something that happened in the past, they're dredging up old trash. They're bringing up past wounds, that it's unnecessary, that they're vengeful, that they're spiteful, that they're bitter, that
they're uprooting families that are,
they're uprooting families, uprooting churches.
Yeah. Yes.
They're causing unnecessary turmoil within the church, et cetera, et cetera. So, what is the difference between justice and revenge? Wanting to see justice is not the same as revenge, where you take out, you take out your anger, you take it up in your own hands, and you retaliate, and those are not the same things. Justice is foundational.
I think justice comes from a pure heart, and revenge comes from a bitter root, and it's two totally different things.
Completely different.
Yes.
So, it's important to show church leaders that somebody who's seeking justice is actually on a godly path. That is a very godly thing, and that is not the same as revenge. And then finally, how do I find a safe or an aware church? What questions do I ask, and what do I look for? Man, I can't even begin to think of how many times I've been asked that question. How do I find a safe church, or is there such a thing as a safe church? I've talked to people who've been to dozens of churches, and they haven't found a single one of those to be safe churches. So
it's funny
how
that
do we find them?
I saw floating through Facebook yesterday was this meme, and basically what it was saying was, if you are staying away from church, you're a bad person. God never changed. God is, pure and whole, and God is who God is always and forever. It's the people within the church. And I'm thinking, wow, for abuse victims, that's really harsh to say. If you have not found that safe, aware church yet, you're a bad person.
Yeah, again, it goes back to victim blaming and saying the problem is with you, not with the institution.
That's just what this means.
Not with this place where, we just keep producing victim after victim after victim. That's not the problem. Right. You not coming here is the problem.
That's exactly how that was worded. And thought, that's painful.
It's a very big issue. So anyway, if you guys have more questions, please write us, send us messages, let us know. Don't expect an answer because we just don't have that kind of time, unfortunately. But we want to add that to these lists, and we really want to address these in a really structured way, where we can give attention to these questions and give satisfactory answers.
Well, and we will be answering the questions, but not individually at this point.
Right.
We will be answering them collectively in this video series.
Right. So we will leave you with this truth bomb. Whatever question you might have, you are not alone. Please send us your questions, and we want to combine them into resources for you that are helpful, that can help make progress, and we really are going to offer that to you. So thank you for tuning in to this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron. and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent